Esoteric Ebb is a really cool game that wears its primary inspirations blatantly on its sleeve, and to me this unfortunately traps it a bit in its biggest inspiration's shadow. It deliberately places itself in conversation with Disco Elysium in a quite interesting way if you look past the blunt similarities, but those similarities are so blunt as to be, at times, a little undermining. Since I've spoken before about what I think a good Disco Elysium successor looks like, placing a lot of value on works that can carry the spirit of this inspiration while firmly carving out their own identities, I figure it makes sense to talk a bit about how Esoteric Ebb deliberately leans into the inspiration for better and sometimes for worse. And to be clear, I'll be talking about it without spoilers, except for some very vague, non-specific remarks about plot structure and protagonist backstory. If you haven't played this game, or have started but haven't finished, you should be fine unless your spoiler standards are extremely strict.
Look, apple chips, you talking apples, got 'em. Big ass booty, that's an apple bottom. Apple pie, that's the appetizer. Double cup full of the apple cider.
In 2018, Stefan Holter wrote very negatively about the band Greta Van Fleet for the Gazelle, calling them the Led Zeppelin cover band. He wrote, "I am a firm believer in the idea that one does not need to reinvent the wheel to make great music. Some of the best albums come from artists who embody a genre and build upon its stylistic tropes to create fantastic work. However, in the case of Greta Van Fleet, it is no longer about embracing a style, but rather about blatantly copying an entire sound." One of the first times I heard about Greta Van Fleet was in the context of, listen to this artist, they sound like Led Zeppelin. And of course, being likened to one of the greatest rock bands is cause for excitement. However, the novelty fades quickly, and it becomes apparent that this striking similarity is not a cause for celebration. Greta Van Fleet seems to outright steal the sound, guitar riffs, and vocal performance of this legendary band, which begs the question, why shouldn't I just listen to Led Zeppelin? I personally have not listened to much Greta Van Fleet, and it's been 8 years since Holter's article, so I will not be providing any opinion of my own on the specific "is Greta Van Fleet a ripoff" debate, and even if it was true then, it may not be true anymore for all I know. But I do think that his passage is a good articulation of the general pitfalls of an artist copying too much from their inspirations, regardless of whether or not his critique was accurately applied in this case. When watching the trailers for Esoteric Ebb, the more similarities I saw with Disco Elysium, the more worried I was. Disco's style is so distinctive, so recognizable, that following it along too closely can raise the question, why aren't I just playing Disco right now? In both games, you play as a screw-up law enforcement officer of some description, tasked with solving a crime in an extremely politically charged neighborhood, acting with extreme eccentricity while a straight-man partner rolls his eyes at your antics, but, if you play right, slowly warming up to you anyway. As your own personified stats chime in regularly to offer advice and argue with each other as embodiments of your fractured psyche. Even the climax is structured similarly, at least in the abstract. If it were a few of these elements, it would not feel like as much of a disco cover act. But by doing all of these things, it sometimes feels like I'm just playing Disco Elysium again, not playing a game inspired by it. Fortunately, when Ebb is covering disco, it does it very well.
Oh my god, you're copying me. You're literally...
Well, you know what they say, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
I like the adaptation of the disco skill personalities into traditional Dungeons & Dragons attributes, like how charisma is deeply cynical and manipulative, or how intelligence is highly egotistical, or how strength is both classical heroism but also chauvinism. The attributes are thus expanded beyond personality and physical traits to distinct moral philosophies, and that's really cool. And because Ebb personifies the 6 core attributes of the D&D system instead of the 18 skills, the game can give each personality slice more focus, make each more complex, and give them more of a feeling of a broader philosophical archetype. Strength is more than just Disco's endurance again, even if a lot of its lines do, in fact, feel like Disco's endurance again. Esoteric Ebb's humor also nails its moments of impersonation. The frequent "I'm apolitical actually" dialogue options feel ripped directly out of Disco's library of moralist cop-out answers to ideological questions, and it's as fittingly satirical now as it was then. The cleric Ragan, the protagonist, has plenty of funny lines of his own and great exchanges with his companion Snell. The Ragan-Snell dynamic is a bit of an odd one in the context of this conversation, conversation because Snell and Kim Kitsuragi have very different backstories, but by playing straight man to an unstable and unpredictable player character, a lot of their lines end up feeling similar. I don't think that Snell ends up having as many layers as Kim, but he does get a much more personal stake in the main plot than Kim ever does, and he has clearer life goals. So because of that, I could imagine someone saying they actually like Snell more. Not me, but someone, maybe. Unlike Disco Elysium, you can expand your party a little bit, situationally, and I liked the other main companion a lot and almost wished they had Snell's prominence instead. That's not to say the humor is all a disco imitation. Terry Pratchett's Discworld has also been an obviously large influence, given the nature of the esoteric coast setting as standard fantasy setting that is modernizing. And also, both worlds are flat, with Ebbs having stuff on the underside, which is really cool. I think the moment that made Discworld's influence clearest to me is when someone said "Jeez," a word which comes from Jesus in the real world. And I saw the game's lore entry reveal that in the esoteric coast, there was once a giant goose named Jesus. Geezus. So I guess in this world it's pronounced Geese, actually. Pratchett made several etymology jokes like this, such as in the book Jingo when he used the phrase Pavlovian response, and a footnote tells us that in Discworld this came from a wizard training a dog to respond to a ringing bell by eating a strawberry meringue, aka a pavlova. Ebb also features a whole calendar of fantasy months, but inexplicably, one of the months is still March, which is when the game takes place. And also when it came out. You know how the community of the visual novel Valhalla has their daily Valhalla tradition, where they'll start playing on real-life December 13th because that's the in-game first day, and then they'll go each day in real time? I bet Esoteric Ebb could have a similar tradition. Anyway, with Discworld, Terry Pratchett parodied a lot of fantasy tropes while also building a cohesive, constantly changing world, sprinkled with silly pop culture references that he often made sure to give in-universe justifications for. Esoteric Ebb does all of this as well, partly because D&D shenanigans tend to naturally gravitate towards being like Discworld anyway, but also because the Esoteric Coast is a well-thought-out setting, built to use fantasy tropes to comment on social change. The moment-to-moment writing feels like Disco, but the playful twists on standard fantasy tropes feel like Discworld. This game features a reference to that Mario the Idea versus Mario the Man joke essay, and also an extended monologue from Wisdom about gender theory. Perchance. Esoteric Ebb feels a little like it's pulling a double bluff with its disco imitation. Its art style and music are significantly different, very much doing their own gorgeous things. The introduction of Dungeons and Dragons spells to the game mechanics expands your possible problem solving quite a bit from Disco Elysium's baseline of pure stat checks. It gives you some options beyond what's simply presented in dialogue choices, which admittedly I tended to forget about often. But it makes the actual combat encounters this game has extra interesting. And depending on what spells you have prepared in advance, you can turn the tide with, for example, a grease spell to instantly win a short fight on a precarious bridge. Then you go past this D&D surface and you get the extensive dialogue trees with your own stats, and with your exasperated companion as you have 5 in-game days to solve a mystery with time advancing only in conversation. And it feels like it's a really good but ultimately derivative Disco Elysium cover. But then you dig even deeper. Get further into the game and learn more about who Ragan is, what the city of Novrik is and how it functions, and what the social situation is like. And you likely find that Esoteric Ebb's approach to politics and identity is not merely imitative of Disco Elysium's, it is complementary. It is exploring aspects of these broader topics that Disco didn't or couldn't. The key difference is that Disco Elysium's protagonist and world are marred by failure and pain. The detective is a middle-aged man haunted by his own self-destructive mistakes, and his arc, depending on the player, is about choosing to try to improve or get worse. Revachol is intensely melancholic, infested with failure. There is, crucially, hope, but that hope is hard-won, and dim and challenged by existential danger. Meanwhile, in Esoteric Ebb, the protagonist and city are defined by nervous but invigorating potential. The city of Novrik is about to have its first ever democratic election, and that fact alone speaks to exciting change, even though most people you talk to expect the current regime to get enough votes to stay in power and mostly maintain the status quo anyway. There's obviously cynicism and manipulation presented by a lot of the characters, and the history of the Esoteric Coast setting features plenty of atrocity and failure to learn about. But nevertheless, the city feels like it is building rather than crumbling. Cleric Ragan is not middle-aged, he's in his late 20s. He's not haunted with regret over a past relationship, he's desperate to have a new relationship. He still has most of his life ahead of him, so he is not trying to pick up the pieces and rebuild as much as he is trying to build in the first place. The amnesiac detective is reflective about the past he can rediscover, while the cleric, who despite some early disorientation is ultimately not amnesiac, is fixated on what might happen in the future. Esoteric's brighter art style reflects this greater optimism, and the game as a whole projects a younger perspective. Perhaps in that sense, it is fitting that its influences are so clear, like a little boy dressing up as the dad he admires. Very fitting, actually, given the glimpses of Ragan's backstory we get to learn. When these flashbacks begin is when the game started to come into its own for me. Ragan's insecurities and obsessions, his scattershot explorations of every major ideology, and his messy approach to his own masculinity are elucidated quite well through these memories. And since we never see the detective's upbringing, this is another way Esoteric Ebb can differentiate itself from Disco Elysium. Though you get to pick background focuses and character creation, the blurbs for the various choices aren't actually mutually exclusive. It seems that they are, in fact, a single sequential backstory. I said I wouldn't get into spoilers, and even though this isn't really a plot twist, I will still hold off on going into detail here, but I find what we learn about Ragan's mother to be fascinating, a critical piece of the game's approach to politics and how Ragan struggles with his own feelings of what it means to be a man. Writing for Mothership, Zoe Hanna says of this game, "Strength is often icky to me, advising Ragan to talk down to marginalized races and use physical force to get what he wants, but it isn't always inherently evil or wrong. Instead, it presents an incredibly realistic and thus incredibly flawed view of manhood, stoic, unchanging, positive it's correct despite evidence to the contrary. And that's what I love about Beauregard's clearly nuanced understanding of feminism. It is a political ideology that is actually also about men, who are underserved by rigid gender norms. It is about the things strength misses out on because it refuses to move or change. It is about the ways strength abuses institutional power opportunistically, even if it means hobbling through an encounter early in the game. There is no option to play as a woman or non-binary person in this game, and there shouldn't be. This game is about the expectations we have of men and of people who are not men, and the things men can do to accept or reject those expectations. Disco Elysium explores this as well, but much less centrally. The detective's pathologies towards women seem rooted in his difficulties with rejection, with failure, more than with his constructed self-image. The ways his issues come from cultural expectations are interpretable.
In a fierce discharge of masculine energy, someone has ripped half the faucet off.
But not brought to the center of the game's themes, as they are in Esoteric Ebb. The cleric is, as part of his youth, struggling with the expectations of what he feels he is supposed to be, and this lends his antics a different tone from the detectives, even though many of them are textually reminiscent. Once again, the cleric is figuring himself out, the detective is putting himself back together. Esoteric Ebb is a coming-of-age story, for the cleric and for the city of Norvik itself. This is what sets it apart the most from its most obvious inspiration. The Esoteric Coast setting is another great distinguishing element. Some of my favorite parts of it I can't get into because you learn about it by exploring the city below dungeon area and, again, avoiding spoilers, but let's just say, two of my favorite characters in the game you meet at the very deepest levels of the map. Both provide cool elaborations on the setting, and one of those two has a conversation gimmick that plays with the medium in a very fun way. Since this is a homebrew setting for a Dungeons & Dragons system, you get the elves, dwarves, goblins, liches, celestials, and other familiar species, and they mostly work as they do in a setting like Faerun. But I would compare Esoteric Ebb's adaptation of these familiar elements to something like Pillars of Eternity, taking familiar concepts in less standard directions than they may at first appear. Celestials are eerily otherworldly. The dwarves may have the sort of stock dwarven industriousness, but this has been adapted into also making the dwarves the center of the Esoteric Coast's labor movement. Asgalism, after the dwarf Asgal ascended to godhood as his worker revolution grew. I like the way the gods work in this world. Long story short, there were true outer gods who were sealed out of the realm by its creator Jor, but the divine essences they left behind could and did bind with certain mortals, who became known as walking gods, founders of kingdoms and movements and religions until, by the time of the game, they are all gone, leaving fading remnants of their power to still be channeled by their faithful. I won't directly quote this piece because the relevant sections are too heavy with spoilers, but in Cass Barkman's piece for Checkpoint Gaming, she compares the Esoteric Coast's gods to player characters in more traditional RPGs, elevated individuals embodying an entity outside their actual world, and thus able to drastically reshape it for everyone else. And by making us play as a devotee of such a figure this time instead of a true power fantasy protagonist, Esoteric Ebb brings our attention to the perspectives of the NPCs in the aftermath of such grand adventures. This is where I see the game's Planescape Torment influences come through most clearly, aside from the opening image of waking up on a slab. Planescape Torment dedicates a lot of its time to exploring the metaphysics of a D&D type cosmology, and to ways that cosmology could affect the people living in it. Esoteric Ebb's depiction of gods as player characters, if you agree with that reading, goes further by tying its meta element to broader ideas about political power and agency. Beyond this, I personally don't see much direct similarity between Ebb and Torment, but I'd be happy to see any comments elaborating on any other direct connections that I missed. In my video about Norco and Slay the Princess, I held those games up as true successors to Disco Elysium for carrying on similar spirits and ideas while standing as unique experiences in their own right, and said that successors that try to adhere to Disco Elysium too closely will be trapped in its shadow. I came away from Esoteric Ebb liking it a lot, being intrigued by its characters and world and all the ways it too stood apart from Disco, and still happily entertained by what it copied. But by taking so much of the plot structure and week-long time limit and stat personifications and buddy cop dynamic all at the same time, it straps itself inescapably into the shadow. Even the Splinter Faction successor projects now named Zero Parades and Tangerine Antarctic, neither of which I expect to be as good as Ebb turned out, at least seem to be trying to superficially differentiate themselves from Disco more than Ebb does, with different base premises and protagonist concepts. On the other hand, this may have been to Ebb's benefit. As I've described, it can be seen as a complementary elaboration of things Disco didn't put as much emphasis on, casting both games as meaningful pieces of the same larger conversation. It may not have been able to do this so clearly without the mimicry. And from more of a publicity sense, by inserting itself into the Disco Elysium Successor discourse, it guaranteed interest in it from a dedicated fanbase hungry for more of their favorite game and angry at its IP owners for mistreating its developers. Positioning itself as a professionally unrelated but stylistically familiar alternative to the Zom Splinter Faction attempts is savvy marketing. And while I hate referring to business stats like number of Steam reviews or player counts because those numbers mean nothing in terms of real quality, the fact that Esoteric Ebb has over twice the Steam reviews as Norco indicates that its invitation of the comparison has worked pretty well for it. Slay the Princess is still way ahead, but anyway. I know that developer Christopher Bodegard was working on this game for years, even before Disco came out, and I don't mean to imply that his close adherence to Disco was out of cynical business sense more than sincere love. I just want to recognize that abiding by my preferences of downplaying the Disco influence more may have hindered the game's success. I'm sure, given the game's fantastic reception so far, that Bodegard's future projects will include a sequel. I hope this can be a springboard for an Esoteric Ebb 2 that fully comes into its own. I'd love to look back on this game in the future and say, this was a great if derivative start to a brilliant and unique series. I believe Bodegard can pull it off. In the meantime, I hope it's been abundantly clear that I'd still highly recommend Esoteric Ebb, and still Norco and Slay the Princess, obviously. Will I even try Zero Parades or Tangerine Antarctic? I don't currently plan to, but who knows. Anyway, thanks for watching, like and subscribe and whatnot, and huge thanks, as always, to my Patreon supporters.